So today we come to chapter 7 and the beginning of a new section in the book of Isaiah. This is actually the beginning of the body of the text proper. You may remember that chapters 1 through 5 were his introduction. Chapter 6, he told the story of his call into the ministry, which acted kind of as a climax to the introduction and a transition into this new section that we're coming to today. And so we come to, this section is chapters 7 through 12, and it contains some of the scriptures that many of us have heard many times, those of us who attend church. And I wanted to introduce this section by just talking about some of the emphases in this section. We see Assyria being used as an instrument of the Lord. Assyria, their incursion into Israel and then Judah was not just simply an accident of history. It wasn't simply because mankind likes to enlarge his own situation, but it's because God was using Assyria as discipline for his own children. And in this section, we also have an emphasis on children. We have children all over the pages in these chapters. We have Isaiah's son, Shear-Jashub. That was his first son. And then we have another son mentioned that would be born, named Immanuel. This is the passage that you are undoubtedly very familiar with. And then we have another son of Isaiah mentioned, Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. Wonderful name, if anybody needs a name for a child. And obviously that has a special meaning because, well, we'll get to that. And then in chapter 8, Isaiah talks about his children as a unit. You know, myself and my children are symbols to the nation of Israel. And finally, in chapter 9, verse 6, we have reference to a royal child that was to be born, and he's described as Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. So we have all of these children in here in this passage. We also have an emphasis on the importance of trusting in the Lord. You know, Israel and Judah were tempted, in fact they did, make alliances with the nations around them when God was offering himself as their security. And they could have trusted in him, but they didn't. And so that emphasis is here in these chapters as well. And finally, I wanted to talk about some things about prophecy and how we understand it. And there's a contrast that we see in this passage between predictive prophecy and typological prophecy. Now, these terms may not be familiar with you, but this is a great passage to talk about it because we see them both in this passage. Now, predictive prophecy is a foretelling of a specific event. And this is the kind of prophecy that we are most familiar with. One of the prime examples we have is from the book of Micah, where he says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." And as you know, that's exactly what happened with the birth of Jesus. And the amazing thing to me is that the scribes in the court of Herod recognized this prophecy and recognized the fulfillment of it. And this is what we mean by predictive prophecy. The principle here is the principle of fulfillment. It was predicted to happen, and here it is. Okay. So that's a very simple methodology of fulfillment. The second type of prophecy we have is what is called typological prophecy. And before we talk about typological prophecy, we should talk about types in general. So a type is when we have something stated in the Old Testament that is just a shadow of what is going to happen in the New Testament. For example, in the Old Testament, we have sacrifices in the sacrificial system. And in the New Testament, we read about the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, right? And the book of Hebrews says that we have a better sacrifice. And this is the principle that we see in typological fulfillment, in that it's a principle of intensification. We have a better sacrifice. In the Old Testament, God made a covenant with his people. And in the New Testament, Hebrews says that we have a better covenant. Right? So this is what is meant by types and their fulfillment. So typological prophecy is not a prophecy of a specific event, but a pattern of events. So the prophecy will be of something that's going to happen in the near term, that is a shadow of the greater thing that's going to happen later on. And so this is the principle of intensification. So let me give you an example, not from this section. We have the prophecy in Jeremiah 31 that says, "A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted." All right. So in the original context, this most definitely was a prophecy about the Babylonian exile, and that they would be carried off Judah would be carried off into exile. And in fact, Ramah, the reference here, is on the main road from Judah into exile. They walked right past it. So it was a prophecy of exile, but Matthew applied it to the slaughter of children by Herod, as you recall. And so just as in the original context, Jeremiah prophesies a return from the land of the enemy and a hope for their future, and he prophesies that right after this prophecy of exile. So God was also was able to bring a wonderful blessing out of this disaster brought by Herod. So Herod had planned this terrible thing for this terrible slaughter, but out of that, God was able to bring the salvation of the whole world because he saved his son. So the meaning, it still has a meaning of an intended disaster, but God was able to bring good out of it, and much greater good. We're going to see this principle in this passage. I wanted to introduce the idea here. So this section, chapters 7 through 12, is all based on a particular historical event, a particular crisis, which happened in around 735 or 734 BC. And so let's read these verses regarding this history. Isaiah 7, 1 through 9. Perhaps, Jeff, would you mind reading those verses for us?
Sure. The sign of Immanuel. When Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, the king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out, you and your son Shear-Jeshub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool, on the road to Launderer's field. Say to him, be careful, keep calm, and do not be afraid. Do not lose heart because of those two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram, and of the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says. It will not take place, it will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all.
Okay. So lots of history here, lots of names, and when you have these names, you just pick a pronunciation and go with it, right? So we read in the chapter, in verse 1, that there were 3 kings that were mentioned here, and I list them here just so you can have kind of a cheat sheet as you look through this passage. We have Ahaz, who was the son of Jotham, who was the son of Uzziah, and he was the king of Judah. And we have Rezin, king of Aram, that is modern-day Syria. And we have Pekah, the son of Remaliah, who is the king of Israel. And of course, Israel was the northern kingdom of the Jewish people. And Israel is also called Ephraim in this passage because Ephraim was the principal tribe of that northern kingdom. So we have 3 nations, we have 3 kings. And Ahaz was the king of Judah, and he was a wicked king, going so far as even to offer his sons as offering to the foreign gods. So in verse 1, we read that these kings had decided to join forces against Ahaz. And we read that in verse 1 that they could not overpower it. So in other words, Isaiah gives us the end result right at the beginning. This is a summary statement before we get the details. So he's telling his readers, as you read through here, all of this fear that Ahaz had was totally unfounded, because as a reader we know that Assyria and Israel were never going to overpower Judah. So he didn't really have to be afraid in the first place, but he was. So Assyria was in the process of making a westward move. And Assyria and Israel realized that the Assyrians were coming. And they wanted Judah to be part of an alliance against them. Well, Judah didn't want to for their own reasons. And so Syria and Israel decided they would simply take them by force, and even if they couldn't be an alliance, perhaps they could, conscript them in and take the riches and enrich themselves and be able to withstand Assyria better. And of course, that made Ahaz extremely frightened. It said that he was just shaking like a tree in the wind. So in verse 3, we read, God says to Isaiah, "Go out, you and your son, Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the washerman's field." Now, Shear-Jashub is a name that means a remnant will return. So in other words, his name was a prophecy with some hope in it, a faint hope, in that you knew 2 things. One, the people are going to return, but the people who returned were only a remnant, right? And Isaiah had probably had named his son before this event, obviously, probably as a result of his commissioning experience that we read in the last chapter. And it's really interesting to imagine that how having his son there could have, had Ahaz been sensitive to the moment, could have been a witness to Ahaz, because here is Isaiah talking to Ahaz, and he says, "Here, hold my hand, a remnant shall return." And it's a way of giving a message to the king without really telling him something. You see what I'm saying? So his son was that message all the time. A remnant will return. And Isaiah met Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct. And you just keep that in mind, because this location is going to feature again in Isaiah chapter 36. So when we get there, we're going to see the same location. Probably Ahaz was inspecting the water supply in preparation for an expected siege. If they were going to have a siege of this city, he wanted to make sure the water supply was up to snuff, right? And God describes, God through Isaiah describes these two kings in such a wonderful way. He says, these two smoldering stubs of firewood. You know, what a striking metaphor. They were not the great fire they once were, and they had no power at all. They were just two smoldering stubs. In verse 6, we get a little bit of an idea as to what they had planned. Let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves and make the son of Tabeel king over it. So they were going to take all the good stuff out of Judah, and they were going to install a puppet king. We have no other information about who this son of Tabeel is, but obviously he would have been beholden to Israel and Syria. So here in verse 8, we have this first prophecy of a very specific event, an event prophecy, what was the word I used? Predictive prophecy. It says, within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. So this prophecy came in 735, 734, and by the time we get to 670 BC, Assyria had taken over Israel, and they had settled foreign colonists in Israel. And so it was absolutely about 65 years. And Isaiah says, if you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. So Isaiah is offering Ahaz ultimate stability through trust in the only true sovereign. And Ahaz turned it down. Okay. So, let's read the next section, beginning with verse 10. Here we see the sign of Immanuel. We're not going to read all of this, but I'll just read some of it. In verse 10, again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. So presumably God said this to Ahaz through Isaiah, right? But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. He's being just so spiritual here. He's not going to put God to the test. Really, he already had his mind made up. He was going to make an end run around Israel and Syria, and he was going to make an alliance with Assyria, which he did do. So he made an alliance with his greater enemy to take out his lesser enemy. And that's exactly what he did. But he didn't want to hear any sort of prophecy that would counteract what he already had in mind, right? And then Isaiah said, hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of men? Will you try the patience of my God also? Now, notice that he uses the word my God. Back in verse 10, he had said, ask the Lord your God for a sign. And here he says, will you try the patience of my God? So because Ahaz has rejected God and gone his own way, he really no longer has the right to call God his God. And Isaiah realizes that, and he changes his pronouns. Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Even though you didn't ask for one, you didn't want one, he's going to give you one anyway. And the sign is, the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Immanuel. He will eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject, I better read this again. I don't think I'm reading this right. No, that's correct. Sorry. He will eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. The Lord will bring on you and your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any, since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. So, this verse obviously is a verse that we have heard many, many times. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Immanuel. And because Matthew directly quoted this verse within the context of Jesus' virgin birth, this verse is of extreme interest to Christians, and much has been written about it. I would say a lot has been written about it. But we can summarize the issues involved with this verse with three questions. First, so is virgin the correct translation, the English translation of the word here? So that's one question we need to answer. I remember when I was in high school or junior high or something or other, there was a big to-do in our church about this, terrible liberal translation of the Bible called the Revised Standard Version. Because they had not used the word virgin in this passage. They said a woman will conceive and bear a child, and that's because they were really not even Christians, and they didn't even believe in the virgin birth. Well, that was the way the story was told in my church when I was growing up. Well, but it's a legitimate question. Is virgin the right word to use to translate it into English? So we need to understand here. There was a number of words that what Isaiah could have used in this passage. And there is a word that he could have used if he had meant specifically to refer to virginity. And that word is betula. That word is available, it's unambiguous, because it's a cognate of the word hymen. So there was no question what he's talking about, all right? But Isaiah didn't use that word. Instead, he used another word that's a little bit more ambiguous, called alma, which simply means a young woman of marriageable age. Now, in the culture, any young woman of marriageable age would have been assumed to be a virgin. But it doesn't specifically say she was, okay? And the closest word that we have in English is the word maiden, which has that same assumption. But because it's rather an old-fashioned word, that wouldn't really be a good translation to use in a modern-day English translation of the Bible. So, what to do is really the question here. So when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, a couple centuries before Christ, the Jewish translators realized that the cultural expectation of this word alma was that she would be a virgin. And so what they translated into Greek, they used the word parthenos, which in Greek means specifically virgin. And when Matthew gives his quotation in Matthew chapter 2, he quotes from the Greek translation, not the original Hebrew, but the Greek translation. So when our English translators translate the Greek New Testament, they rightly translate it as virgin, you see, because it's correct. And most translations also translated virgin here for that same reason, that culturally it would have been assumed, virginity would have been assumed, but it's not necessarily specifically stated here. Now that becomes important later on as we talk about what it means, okay? So the next question we need to answer is, well then who is this child Immanuel that Isaiah was talking about? And again, Matthew applies this prophecy specifically to Jesus Christ. The word Immanuel means God with us, and Matthew is saying that Jesus is God with us. But here's the thing. If Immanuel is only Jesus, in what sense is that a sign to Ahaz? Because Ahaz was given a sign, and how could it possibly be a sign to Ahaz if it was going to be fulfilled only, 600 or 700 years in the future? It would have had no effect on Ahaz at all. So this is where it is best to understand this as a typological prophecy, where initially the birth of Isaiah's son, that we're going to see in the next chapter, we haven't got to it yet, but the birth of Isaiah's son was a sign from God that Ahaz should have recognized, or could have recognized had he chosen to. But that Immanuel type would be fulfilled in a much greater way in the future. All right? The third question we should answer here is this idea of God with us. Is that a message of blessing, or it is a message of fear? So those of us who have grown up in the church and think and hear the word God with us, we immediately think what a wonderful blessing that is. Rightly so. It is a tremendous blessing that God can be with us, and not only with us, but live inside of us. But if you were Ahaz, what would that message mean to you? God with us. Well, it should have meant fear, because Ahaz was not following what God wanted to do. He was not trusting in God, and he was not doing God's will. That should inspire fear if God is right there with you. And so I think it's important that we see both meanings of that term, that we understand it. Now let's look at some specifics about this prophecy here in verse 15, because Isaiah gives some specifics here that help us to pinpoint the time frame that we're talking about. He says that Immanuel, verse 15, will eat curds and honey, really, when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. Now, just a little bit earlier, he had said that it was going to be 65 years, so he had put an actual time on it. And here he speaks about it metaphorically. He's going to eat curds and honey. So, and this will be before or about that time he knows the difference between right and wrong. Now, in Jewish culture, the age of accountability for what is right and what is wrong was considered to be about 12 or 15. So the incursion of Assyria into Israel happened, I believe it was 721 when Israel fell, and then they came on down into Judah. It's about 12 years after this prophecy in 734, isn't it? Approximately. And what is this idea about eating curds and honey? What is that all about? Well, we get some reference to that in a little bit later in the chapter, verse 22, maybe verse 21. In that day, this is the day of Assyria's coming into Judah. In that day, a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 goats. And because of the abundance of milk they give, he will have curds to eat. Now, this is seems a bit odd to us who don't keep animals and don't live in a culture like that. But in other words, because of the wartime, the population of the country had been so decimated that this farmer here with his 1 cow and his 2 goats didn't have very many mouths to feed. And they gave so much milk that if he was going to preserve it at all, he had to make cheese out of it. Okay? And so this is what we're talking about here. He will eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the right and choose the wrong. Now, let's take a look over in chapter 8. We're going to talk about this this son of Isaiah, that I've already hinted at to you, is a shadow fulfillment of this prophecy of Immanuel. Okay? Chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. The Lord said to me, take a large scroll and write on it with an ordinary pen, Meher Shalal Heshbaz. And I will call in Uriah the priest and Zechariah son of Jeberechiah as reliable witnesses for me. So he says he's going to take a large scroll. A better translation would be like a large tablet. It's not really a scroll per se, but more like a placard made out of wood or metal that anyone could read. He was going to write on it with an ordinary pen, so anybody could read it. And what he wrote on there was this name, Meher Shalal Heshbaz, which means speeding to the plunder, hurrying to the spoil. So this is a reference to the plundering that happens with the spoils of war. And it was a warning to the Jewish people that they were soon to be invaded, and they were going to be, the country was going to be raped of all of its treasure and all of its goodness. And so every time, this kid's, mother called him in, it was speeding to the plunder, hurrying to the spoil. It was a message to Isaiah's neighbors, right? And so it was a message to the people who, his neighbors who witnessed the birth of his son, and they were constantly reminded of this uncomfortable future. And Isaiah called in the public figures of the day as reliable witnesses because he wanted to make sure that people didn't think that he had named his son after the fact. He named it before it happened. And then it says, verse 3, then I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said to me, name him Meher Shalal Heshbaz. Before the boy knows how to say, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. So, he says, I made love to the prophetess, or I went to the prophetess, depending on your translation. Now this is kind of a euphemism that was often used in the Old Testament. Made love was a euphemism specifically for first intercourse. Okay? Now, Isaiah already had a son, right? So many people take this reference to mean that Isaiah's first wife had died and he remarried, and presumably she was a virgin, yes? And he went into her and she gave birth to a child. Now, this was not a virgin birth, but this is in part the first installment, shall we say, on this Immanuel prophecy. So that when we have this speeding to the plunder, hurrying to the spoil, who was born, that it's a message from God. That God is with us and God is going to judge us and God is not going to allow your untrusting attitude to go on forever. Okay? Now, whether she was called the prophetess because she was married to a prophet, or whether she was actually a prophetess in her own right, we don't know. It could have been one or the other. So let's compare these two child signs that we have here. We have Immanuel and we have Meher Shalal Heshbaz. So Immanuel was a sign that was given to Ahaz, right? But Meher Shalal Heshbaz was a sign that was given to the people of Judah, to the people that were living around Isaiah. Both signs were signs of both hope and doom. Okay? And in verse, they're described very similarly. In chapter 7:14, we read, she will conceive and give birth to a son. And chapter 8, verse 3, we read, she conceived and gave birth to a son. In 7:14, we read, she will call him Immanuel. In 8:3, it says, name him Meher-Shalal-Hashbaz. And this, I think, is the most interesting one. In chapter 7, verse 16, the description is, before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. And in chapter 8, verse 4, regarding Meher-Shalal-Hashbaz, says, before the boy knows how to say, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. So, in many ways, these children are to be, they're the same. Now, within this passage, chapters 7 and 8, we also have a number of references to Assyria and how God is using Assyria. And this is an example of how God with us is also a message of fear. We read that Assyria was going to be a razor in the hand of God. Think about that, how in the Jewish culture, shaving was a very shameful thing, and God was going to do it with his razor. We also read that Assyria was going to be a flood. The capital of Assyria was right over there next to the river Euphrates, and this river Euphrates was going to just flood in and flood the entire land. It would be reaching up to your neck, it says in verse 8. In chapter 8, verse 8, we read that this flood would cover the breadth of your land, O Immanuel. Now that's interesting. Your land, O Immanuel. Isaiah must know that this prophecy of Immanuel doesn't end with his son, because his son certainly didn't own or have any claim on the land of Israel. But the land of Judah is termed your land, O Immanuel. So I think Isaiah is saying more than he really understands that he's saying, and that this prophecy has a much greater fulfillment in the future, as we do know from the book of Matthew. Chapter 8, verse 9. Raise the war cry, you nations, and be shattered. Listen, all you distant lands. Prepare for battle and be shattered. Devise your strategy, but it will be thwarted. Propose your plan, but it will not stand, for God is with us. There we see God with us as a message of hope. That while God is going to use Assyria to bring judgment on his people, ultimately, Assyria was going to lose, and God is going to bring judgment on Assyria. It's because God is with us. Let's look quickly at some of the theological reflections that we have at the end of this chapter, that Isaiah, as he thinks about all of this, and we can get some idea as to how we are to respond to the message of this passage. We're going to look at chapter 8, verse 11 and following. Isaiah says, the Lord spoke to me with his strong hand upon me, warning me not to follow the way of his people. Now, so here we have an example of Isaiah being inspired by God, and I think undoubtedly there were times that prophets spoke and they didn't hardly even realize they were speaking for God sometimes, but Isaiah says here, very definitely, he felt God's hand on him, and God was speaking. And God says, don't follow the way of this people. He said, do not call conspiracy everything these people call conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, and do not dread what they dread. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread, and he will be a sanctuary for you. But for both houses of Israel, he will be a stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes him fall. And for the people of Jerusalem, he will be a trap and a snare. Many of them will stumble, but they will fall and be broken. So, the character of God doesn't change. But for some people, he's going to be a sanctuary, and for others, he's going to be a stumbling block. And it all depends on their response to him, what they do. It depends on their choice. And that, I think, is the message that we take from this. That God with us, it is a wonderful message of blessing. It's also a message of fear. And how we respond to this determines how we experience God. And for those of us who have chosen to follow God, and we've chosen to walk in his way and to receive his Son as our Savior, we do so not being giddy and flippant, but we have to remember that God is also God with us in the sense of inspiring a proper fear and reverence for him. And when we choose to follow him, we better go all the way. We better go all the way. Let's pray, shall we? Dear Father, the message that you've given us today is, in some ways, I feel a bit heavy. And in some ways, a bit hard to understand. But I also feel like when we grapple with these difficult to understand things, we can discover some amazing things. And your work in us can change our lives. We do make the choice to follow you, Lord, and to acknowledge that you are with us and that you are living inside of us as Christians. But as we do so, we do so with a total commitment, with a commitment that acknowledges that you also are a holy God, and one that deserves our ultimate respect and fear. We thank you for your Son, who allows us to come to you, and through whom we have forgiveness for the failings that we so often have. And so we come to you through your Son in reverence and with commitment. We pray this in Jesus' name.